Between 1941 and 1945, the Eastern Front of World War II consumed over 27 million Soviet lives, cities reduced to rubble, entire populations erased, a continent scarred beyond recognition. Behind this devastation stood two men whose psychological profiles would shape the course of modern history. How did the inner workings of these dictators' minds transform personal pathology into global catastrophe? While Hitler and Stalin shared disturbing psychological patterns, paranoia, ruthlessness, ideological obsession, these manifested in dramatically different strategic approaches that would determine the fate of nations. Adolf Hitler's psychology was forged in humiliation. A failed artist rejected twice by Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, a decorated but ultimately defeated soldier in the trenches of World War I, a revolutionary whose early putsch ended in imprisonment rather than glory. These rejections cultivated an intoxicating mixture of status anxiety and messianic self-image. Hitler developed a pathological need to prove his superiority, a psychological wound that would later manifest militarily in bold, often reckless gambles, stubborn refusal to retreat, and crippling interference with his generals' expertise. Joseph Stalin emerged from entirely different crucible. A seminary student turned revolutionary bank robber, a calculated climber through Bolshevik ranks who eliminated rivals with methodical precision, a man who transformed his Georgian outsider status into an asset through sheer force of will. This background cultivated a psychology of constant suspicion, compartmentalized power structures, and calculating patience. In military terms, this translated to a willingness to sacrifice millions for strategic advantage, a focus on strategic depth, and the prescient relocation of Soviet industry beyond Hitler's reach. Hitler weaponized psychology through blitzkrieg, lightning war designed not just to defeat armies, but to paralyze nations through shock and terror. He understood mass psychology intimately, leveraging propaganda, orchestrated spectacle, and targeted violence to project an aura of invincibility. Yet Hitler's psychological approach contained a fatal flaw. His ideological contempt for Slavic peoples led him to catastrophically underestimate Soviet resilience, while his belief in Aryan superiority created a dangerous overconfidence in German capabilities. Stalin's psychological warfare operated differently. Information became his weapon, controlling what his people knew, what his enemies perceived, and what his own generals could report. His not one step back order exemplified this approach, transforming retreat from a tactical option into a moral failing punishable by death. Stalin's fatal psychological flaw manifested years before the war began. His paranoid Great Purge decimated Soviet military leadership, executing over 30,000 officers and leaving his forces dangerously unprepared for Hitler's onslaught. Fear of potential rivals had weakened his actual defenses. Hitler's most consequential decision, Operation Barbarossa, reveals his psychology in action. The three-pronged invasion of the Soviet Union reflected his contempt for Slavic resistance and pathological overconfidence. Rather than concentrating forces toward a single objective, Hitler's grandiose self-belief led him to simultaneously target Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine. Most tellingly, when faced with the catastrophic encirclement at Stalingrad, Hitler's psychological inability to accept defeat led him to forbid retreat, condemning his Sixth Army to destruction rather than acknowledging tactical reality. Stalin's initial reaction to the Nazi invasion reveals his own psychological blind spot. Despite numerous intelligence warnings, he remained paralyzed for critical days, unable to process Hitler's betrayal of their non-aggression pact. This psychological shock temporarily shattered Stalin's calculating facade. Yet Stalin's longer-term decisions displayed remarkable psychological resilience. His order to dismantle and relocate over 1,500 factories beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach, demonstrated the strategic patience and willingness to absorb catastrophic short-term losses that would ultimately preserve Soviet industrial capacity. Hitler's leadership deteriorated alongside his psychological state. Initially charismatic and decisive, he grew increasingly erratic and isolated. His micromanagement of military operations reached pathological levels, moving non-existent divisions on maps and issuing impossible orders. By 1944, a cocktail of stress, paranoia, and Dr. Morell's pharmaceutical regimen had accelerated Hitler's cognitive decline. His decision-making became increasingly detached from strategic reality, yet his psychological hold over the Nazi hierarchy remained unbroken. Stalin's leadership evolved differently. Cold and calculating in his approach to human cost, he displayed growing military pragmatism as the war progressed. After initial catastrophic losses, Stalin gradually allowed his generals tactical freedom while maintaining strategic control, a psychological flexibility Hitler couldn't match. Stalin's greatest psychological strength in warfare was patience, the ability to absorb devastating losses while positioning for eventual victory. The man who reportedly once said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic," approached warfare with an emotional detachment that proved strategically advantageous. The psychological profiles of these dictators shaped not just the war, but the post-war world. Hitler's increasingly nihilistic psychology culminated in the Nero Decree, his order to destroy Germany's remaining infrastructure rather than surrender it intact. His final act, suicide in a Berlin bunker, reflected a mind that could conceive only total victory or total annihilation. Stalin's paranoid empire building continued long after Hitler's death. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe as Stalin's psychological need for buffer states and security manifested in Soviet occupation. His suspicion of former allies quickly transformed into Cold War hostility. The human cost of their distorted psychologies remains almost incomprehensible: tens of millions dead, displaced, or traumatized. Yet perhaps most disturbing is how effectively both men channeled their personal pathologies into mass movements, bending millions to their psychological distortions. Understanding their psychology helps us recognize similar patterns in other contexts, how damaged minds in positions of power can transform personal pathology into historical catastrophe. Great power conflicts are shaped not just by resources and technology, but by the psychological makeup of leaders, their fears, their delusions, their capacity for both calculation and miscalculation. The minds that create apocalypse are rarely as rational as we need to believe. And therein lies the darkest lesson of history's greatest conflict.